Hey everybody, and welcome back as we dive into a new set for Magic the Gathering, Dominaria United. This set drops in September. We'll be doing a pre-release on Labor Day weekend, but the set release will be a week after, so it'll be the second weekend of September. So with this set coming in, we're visiting a plane that we have been in before. Not only that, this is where Magic the Gathering first started, in the plane of Dominaria. We've seen a lot of different things happen in Dominaria. The first fight with the Phyrexians happened in Dominaria, and this is where we may see things end? Question mark. This is going to be very important to the history of Magic the Gathering, and I'm excited that we get to be a part of this. This set coming in, also this is standard, meaning that we're going to see some sets rotate out. So this is marking a new chapter for the standard rotation. This is going to rotate out Kaldheim, Strixhaven, and Zendikar Rising. So those three sets will rotate out as Dominaria United rotates into this new standard season. So what we're seeing is a return of some mechanics, and we're also seeing even a card, Liliana, a reprint from before. This will make that card standard again. If you have the other copy of the card from the set that is not standard, it would become a standard card. So I want to review over these cards that have been leaked or have been sneak peeked since before today. My time, this is Monday, so I have a lot of cards to go over, and I'm excited to get into them with you guys. Worth noting that from my perspective, a lot of these cards, this will be a blind react to these cards. This is how good I think it is in general. Maybe we'll see it in play. Do I think that this is good in Commander? Do I think it's good in Limited? And I'll make some commentary on Standard as well. But for a more deep dive into Standard rotation, we have someone else on our channel, Scott Trepanier, definitely worth checking out. He talks about how these cards might impact Standard decks that we might now see play because of the cards that we're seeing. What do we think will take over the meta? What things that'll at least be good, synergistically speaking? That's more his realm. I'm going to make comments on them, but keep in mind this is coming from, hey, this is what I think based on the card and how good it is by itself. And I try to take these cards based on just by themselves, and I'll make some commentary after that comment about like, hey, this is where I think we'll see it. So, I'd like to dive into the white cards first. Need some caffeine. That's good. Alright, so we'll start with the Archangel of Wrath. This is a 4-mana 3/4 angel, and this is the first card that we see that is bringing back the kicker mechanic. The way the kicker mechanic works is that you pay a certain cost. In this case, a black, a red, or both, and then you can have an additional effect on the spell. So you could just pay 4 mana and it's a 3/4 flying lifelink angel, or you can pay 5 or 6 mana to get the additional abilities that says when this enters battlefield, if it was kicked, deals 2 damage to any target. If it was kicked twice, deal another 2 damage to any target. So it could be a 6 mana 3/4 flying lifelink, deal 2 damage, gain 2 life, and then 2 life, since lifelink means that whenever you deal damage, you gain that much life. So it makes this card a pretty decent card, and I'm excited to see Kicker come back. It's a relatively simple mechanic to learn, and I definitely think that it'll have a place in Standard, and we already see Kickers get played in Commander format. So I am happy to see this. More angels are fun. I know that there are Commander angel decks. As far as limited draft-wise, I think it's a good draft card, but you have to run 3 colors to make this really work. The other card I want to talk about is the Banality Sleeper. This is a 2-mana 3/1 Phyrexian human soldier. So this is one of the Phyrexian agents. We know that there were some sleeper agents that the Phyrexians are influencing, and so this is one of them. It has a kicker, 1 black mana. When this enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, each player sacrifices a creature, which is pretty strong. At the bare minimum, this gives the player who casts the spell a weak creature that they want to sacrifice, and force your opponent to sacrifice something that obviously they don't want to sacrifice. If you time this right, this can be a really good card to play. In Limited, it's really good because if you are in a situation where you have 1 creature on the board for 2 more mana, you can get this out, sack it, and force your opponent to sacrifice maybe their only creature they have. So this can make a lot of impact in a game. So I like this card. Next we have the charismatic Vanguard, a 3-mana 3/2 dwarf soldier. For 5 mana, 1 white, 4 generic. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. That seems pretty expensive, but in a token deck, I could maybe see that being useful. But it seems quite expensive to me. So for 3 mana, 3/2, alright, and then a 5 mana ability that I'm not all that excited about. Next, we have the Defiler of Faith, a 5 mana, 5/5 Phyrexian human. So this one has Vigilance and has an additional cost to casting white permanent spells. Oh, just white permanent spells in general. You may pay 2 life. Those spells cost a white mana less to cast if you paid life this way, and this effect reduces only the amount of white mana that you would pay. And whenever you cast a white permanent spell, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Okay, I see so this is retroactively, or I guess this is kind of giving your white spells Phyrexian mana. Phyrexian mana was something we saw a while back, which personally I was never really a big fan of. I think there is a huge fan base for Phyrexian mana, but the issue that people ran into with Phyrexian mana is you would play these spells and you would pay life points instead of mana to be able to cast spells that should cost more, and so you're playing off curve in a very big way, and so it could lead to you just getting more value and winning a game, which was the point of it. So I think this is good because this requires you to have 5 mana 5/5 out. So you're not getting Phyrexian mana until turn 5. So I can definitely see that being a useful card. And it creating 1/1 soldier creature tokens makes it a nice addition to human token decks. Especially with this card itself being human, technically. Next is the Guardian of New Banality. This is a 2 mana 2/2 human soldier with enlist. So enlist is that as a creature with enlist attacks, you are allowed to tap a non-attacking creature that you control to add its power and to the creature that is attacking's power. So in this case, it's a 2/2 with enlist. So if it were to attack, you could tap a 1/1, and then this creature would become a 3/2. Or you could tap, say you have a 10/10. You could tap the 10/10, and this would gain 10 power. So it makes this card a lot more powerful, but it does require that the creature that you are tapping that's not attacking also not have summoning sickness. So it has to have been on the board or have haste. Other abilities for this card is that whenever this does enlist, you get to scry 2, which is nice. And if you discard a card, then this gains indestructible until the end of the turn, but it does force you to tap down the creature in response. Not bad. It's pretty decent 2 mana 2/2, and with a bunch of abilities that make it more valuable. I think that's about right. Next we have the Join Forces, a 3 mana instant, untap up to 2 target creatures, and they get +2/+2 until the end of the turn. Not bad. It reminds me of Back-to-Back in Army of 2. It's pretty fun and thematic, especially because in the Dominaria United set, we're seeing a lot of forces come together that otherwise we wouldn't see joining forces, but they have to unite against the greater threat of the Phyrexian. So I like the card thematically speaking, and in terms of its mechanics, 3 mana, essentially +4/+4 worth of stats is good, especially at instant speed. And untapping allows you to do it before the blocker step on your opponent's turn, so this allows it to be reactionary and have an impact on the board off your own turn. So I think that is pretty good. So whether or not we see play, I certainly think this will see play in Standard, is my guess. I don't know as much as Scotch Banner does about Standard stuff. As far as Commander, which I feel like I wouldn't see this card in, I think this card is a little too expensive and not enough value in Commander. Of course, the issue in Commander is that you're competing against cards that have tremendous value. So especially for white, 3 mana, Teferi's Protection is the 3 mana, I'm going to phase out and then win game on my next turn kind of deal. In terms of limited, I definitely think this sees play in draft. I think untapping 2 creatures on the board, giving them +2/+2 each, and then they can block. I mean, that's just a very powerful ability. So I certainly see this card seeing play in limited format. Next we have the Mesa Cavalier. This is a 3 mana 2/1 human knight. So it has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. I think it's a bit pricey for what you're getting. 3 mana 2/1, really easy to deal with that. And it does have flying, making it harder to block, but 1 damage being dealt is pretty easy to do. So I think this card in a lot of different places will not see play. In limited, I could see this seeing play depending on the other things that were drafted, just because a flying creature that can gain you some life points is a bigger deal in limited than it is in other formats. Next up, we have Resolute Reinforcements, a 2-mana, 1/1 human soldier with flash, and when this enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So essentially, you're getting 2 mana 2/2 worth of stats, and that's about right. Dividing that up amongst 2 creatures, I think for that stat line, I'd prefer to have 1 creature, but for humans, or soldiers even, you tend to want to split that up into different ones, because whenever a human enters the battlefield, it's a common effect. If this were creating a human soldier creature token, I think that would have a lot more value. There's probably a reason they chose not to do that. But it having flash means you can also play it on your opponent's turn and have some blockers up if you need them to be there. Maybe after a board wipe, you flash it in, or something along those lines. So a decent card, but not exciting. The next card is Samite Herbalist, which is a 2-mana 2/1 human cleric that, when it becomes tapped, you gain a life and scry 1. That's not bad, especially with the enlist ability. I can see you enlisting this card and getting some value off of that. Makes it, and I think that ability makes this card tremendously valuable in a limited format. In standard, maybe, I'm not sure if you're able to rely on that, but being able to scry is a big deal in standard. And of course, I'll say in Commander, I don't expect to see this card having any play. But still a really good card, and I think it combos really well with Enlist. Next, we have Chalet's Acolyte, which is a 5-mana 3/4 angel with a kicker ability for 1 generic and 1 green, that if this was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it, making it a 7-mana 5/6. 7-mana 5/6 with flying. Honestly, that's not really great. I'm used to angels getting a little bit more value, so I think in limited, it's probably okay. A bit expensive still, even for limited. And for standard, I'm sure that there are some angel synergistic cards that'll make it worth running in standard, but I'm not sure. Next, we have Stall for Time. This is a 3-mana instant that does have a kicker for 1 generic, 1 blue. Tap up to 2 target creatures, and if the spell was kicked, put a stun counter on each of those creatures, and then you get to draw a card. So the stun mechanic is another mechanic they're bringing into Magic the Gathering with the Dominaria United set. With this mechanic, if a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, you would instead remove a stun counter. So this is a way to keep cards tapped down for a certain amount of time, and you would track that with these stun counters. So I think that this card is pretty good. It's nice to do when people go into combat, because in that situation, they move to combat, you cast a spell, and then you tap down some creatures and give them some stun counters. That's really effective because you're not only stopping them from attacking you on their turn, but on your turn, you know that those creatures are stunned, so you're allowed to be a bit more aggressive, knowing that they're still going to stay tapped down on their next turn. So this is a really good card. I certainly think it'll see play in Standard. It seems really good to me. And I even think I'll see this in Commander. I think this is a pretty decent card. As for Limited, a little bit harder to see it in play in Limited, but I'm sure because of the draw card, I think that we'll see it. Requiring 5 mana for the spell to do the stun counter does make it a little bit pricier as an instant for you to play in a limited format. But the card draw is card draw, and it helps replace itself. So I don't think that this is a card you don't want to run. I just think it's a card that's a little harder to work the way it's intended in a limited format. All right, the last card for white, we have Take Up the Shield. This is a 2-mana instant that says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it gains lifelink and indestructible until the end of the turn. So I definitely see this being used aggressively and defensively, and I think this will see play in all formats just because it's so cheap and it does so much. So this is a good card. Alright, next up we have, for blue cards, we're going to start with a Defiler of Dreams. It's a 5-mana 4/3 Phyrexian Sphinx with flying, and as an additional cost to casting blue permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost a blue mana less to cast if you paid life this way. The effect only reduces the amount of blue mana that you would pay, and whenever you cast a blue permanent spell, you draw a card. That can be really strong, and I definitely see this being used in Commander. I believe this would see play in Standard, and maybe in Limited. Again, 5 mana is really hard to play in a limited format, but this is a really fun card. So drawing cards is powerful, so I definitely see this. I think that people will try playing with this card, and I think it's a decent card. Next, we have the Frost Fist Strider. This is a 5 mana 4/4 elemental giant. It has Ward 2, and whenever this enters the battlefield, you tap target creature an opponent controls, and you put a stun counter on it. So 5 mana 4/4. It has Ward, so it protects itself, and then you also force your opponent to have something. So you stall your opponent out in 2 ways. So you stall your opponent out in 2 different ways. One way that if they want to remove this creature, or they want to target it, then they have to pay 2 extra mana, or you counter it. But the other way is that you're also stopping them from having either a defender, or you're stopping them from having an attacker. You're kind of doing both, just depending on how aggressive you are on your turn, or the next turn. So this is a pretty decent card. For 5 mana though, it's always rough to see expensive cards because it's harder to fit those into decks, but I definitely think this is a decent card, and it makes sense for the mana that you're paying for it. Next, we have Impeded Momentum. It's a 2 mana sorcery. Tap target creature and put 3 stun counters on it, and then you get to scry 1. I can definitely see why this is not an instant, and even at sorcery speed, I think this card is going to see play. I think it's a very strong, extremely valuable card to play. So whether it fits into the decks or not, I think people will try to play this card, and I think it'll turn out to be pretty decent. Next, we have the Micromancer, a 4 mana 3/3 human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an instant or sorcery card with a mana value of 1. You reveal that card and put it into your hand and shuffle. So it tutors for a 1 mana instant or sorcery. For 4 mana, that is a little rough, but I'm thinking in Commander, you can tutor for a lot better 1 mana spells than you can in Standard or Limited. So if this does see play, I think we mostly see it in Commander. As for what you're pulling, you're probably pulling Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile. You're probably pulling some sort of removal for that 1 mana instant or sorcery. And so I think maybe, I just feel like for 4 mana it's a bit rough. I understand you're getting a 3/3, but it's a 3/3. It's nothing exciting for turn 4. So I'm not sure. This is a harder one for me to evaluate, but I think it could do some useful things. Next, we have the Phasing of Zhalfir, a 4 mana saga enchantment. I am pretty excited about this one. This one has read ahead. So the read ahead mechanic they're introducing in Dominaria United for the saga spells enchantments. So as you cast the spell, you can choose what chapter you start on instead of starting defaulted to 1. So you still move through each of the chapters forward. You cannot go back. So if you skip a chapter, you're just skipping it. And you still go to the next chapter after your draw step. So none of that changes. You still sacrifice it after chapter 3's resolution. So in this case, you have 3 chapters. 1 and 2 are the same. Another target non-land permanent phases out, and it cannot phase in for as long as you control Phasing of Zhalfir. So this is pretty good. It forces phasing, so it can help you in a way, or it can impede your opponent. But keep in mind, its 3rd chapter is relevant to those that are phased out, because this says it destroys all creatures, and for each creature that was destroyed this way, the controller gets a 2/2 Black Phyrexian creature token. So if you force your opponent to phase out a creature, then when this resolves, their creatures that are phased out will not get destroyed, and they'll phase in on their next turn. So it's worth noting that this can have some backfire part to it, but it's a really useful card, and it's nice that it can enter in 4 mana. You could just start on chapter 3, immediately destroying all creatures. It could be a 4 mana board wipe for blue, which I think is incredibly strong for the Commander format. I think it's pretty decent for the Standard format, and I also think that for Limited you want to run this card. I think that this has a lot of good, especially with a read ahead mechanic, because forcing you to go through your first 2 phases could have been what made this card not as good, but the read ahead mechanic makes this potentially a 4 mana board wipe. It could be a 4 mana start on chapter 2, protect one of your creatures, and on your next draw step it's a board wipe. Either way, this card ends up being really good, and I think that for the most part you'll skip chapter 1, but who knows. Next up, we have Protect the Negotiators, a 2 mana instant with a kicker ability for 1 white. If it was kicked, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, and then you counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 mana for each creature you control. So this is a nice counter spell that rewards you for having tokens, and white is really good at creating those tokens, so it absolutely makes sense that its kicker would be white. This card, for Commander, you'd have to run it in a blue-white minimum, and for Standard and for Limited, it's a little bit harder. I think for Limited it's easier to run cheap counter spells because you're able to play them more efficiently since it's a slower format. In Standard, though, I'm not sure how good this card ends up being in Standard, but I'm interested in seeing that. Next up, we have Rona's Vortex, a 1-mana instant. It has a kicker for 3 mana, 2 generic, 1 black. Return target creature or planeswalker you don't control to its owner's hand, and if the spell was kicked, put that permanent on the bottom of the owner's library instead. So it's a 4-mana return target permanent to the bottom of, or I guess creature or planeswalker, to the bottom of your opponent's library. It's a 1-mana bounce to the hand. Yeah, I don't know. This is not a terrible card. I think it definitely sees play in Limited. I could see it having play in Standard. I think it's a lot harder to run this in Commander. But it's a fun card, and so some people might just try to run it as attack. Next, we have Sphinx of Clear Sky. It's a 5-mana, 5/5 Sphinx with flying and Ward 2, and then the Domain ability. So Domain is, well, I'll read this here because this one actually describes it pretty well, but Domain is a returning mechanic to this set, to Magic the Gathering. We've seen Domain before. So this one says, whenever this deals combat damage to a player, reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is a number of basic land types among lands that you control. And an opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. You put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So it's worth noting, and it says it on this card as well, that a pile can be empty, but odds are you'll choose the empty pile, or you'll choose the pile most beneficial to you, which is the one that has cards in it, because that's what's going to go into the hand. So 5-mana, 5/5, flying, Ward 2, and that ability, I absolutely see this card being good in all formats. Limited, again, it's only hard because it's 5 mana. It's harder to get to the 5 mana in Limited format, but I definitely think that this sees play in Standard, and I could definitely see this seeing play in a Commander format. Next, we have Timely Interference, a 1-mana instant that has a kicker for 1 generic, 1 red. Target creature gets -1 power until the end of the turn, and if the spell was kicked, that creature blocks this turn if it's able, and then you get to draw a card. 1 mana draw 1 card isn't bad. We've seen that before with things like Preordain, Ponder, Brainstorm, but with this, in this case, it's a 1 mana draw card, and its benefit, instead of scrying or looking at your library, its benefit is to maybe remove a creature from the board. So I think that makes this card a lot worse. So I don't see this having any sort of play in Commander, but I definitely see this being used in Limited and maybe in Standard. I'm not sure if it's good enough for Standard, but drawing a card is important, so I definitely see this being used in Limited. Next, we have the Talarian Geyser, a 3-mana sorcery that kicks for a white mana. Return target creature to its owner's hand, draw a card, and if the spell was kicked, you gain 3 life. I think that's a lot of mana to remove one thing. So I don't see this having, I don't believe this will see play in Commander. I think this is valuable enough to run in Limited, and I'm not certain at all if it's going to be in Standard. Next, we have the Talarian Terror, a 7-mana 5/5 Serpent. Seems really bad. It has Ward 2, but it still seems really bad. So, they added this. The spell costs 1 generic mana less to cast for each instant and sorcery card that is in your graveyard. Okay. So, could potentially be a 4-mana 5/5 with Ward 2. Not bad. It's nice to have a beater that can protect itself with Ward, but it's still really tough for me to see this card having much value since it doesn't have flying, it doesn't have trample, it doesn't have any sort of walks at all. So, I think this card doesn't see play in Commander. I think this card doesn't see play in Limited because it's really hard to build up a graveyard in Limited, because you're not cycling through your deck quite as efficiently as this card would seem to require you to do. And whether or not this sees play in Standard, I think entirely depends on the format, and I am not able to predict that one. This card just seems bad. Next, Voda Sea Scavenger, a 3-mana 3/2 Merfolk Rogue with Domain. So in this case, when it enters the battlefield, you get to look at top X cards of your library, X being the number of basic land types among lands that you control, and you may put one of those cards on top of your library and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Not bad. A 3-mana 3/2 with a Domain that lets you kind of scry. Not bad. So pick the best card and keep it on top, and the rest go on the bottom. I think that's absolutely worthwhile to run. I think you definitely see this in Commander at some point, just because Rogue Commander's a thing, Merfolk Commander's a thing. And also, basic land types among lands, well, 5-color decks are a thing, 4-color decks are a thing, so triomes are a thing. So I definitely think this card sees play in Commander. And because they've printed triomes for standard format, I definitely see this seeing play in standard rotation as well, because that'll help. When you have a triome, that's 3 basic land types right there. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 on top and the other 2 on the bottom, and you still got a 3/2 out of it. So I definitely think this sees play in standard. And in limited, I think it's a lot harder to run this in limited, but even just looking at the top card of your library, well, let me double check this card. Yes, okay. I had to double check that this card says you may put one of those cards on top. So yes, even just looking at the top card of your library, you still have the option to put that on the bottom. So it is 3 mana 3/2 scry 1, even if you only have 1 basic land type. So I like this card. And finally for blue, we have the Volshay Tide Turner, a 2 mana 1/3 merfolk wizard that can tap for a blue mana. However, you must spend that mana only to cast instants or sorcery spells or a spell that you've kicked. So, relatively meh card to end on for blue. But we've seen some pretty decent cards. I'm excited about them. And when we get back to our next video, we'll dive into the black cards. So, until next time, later gamers.